Welcome to the Biotech Startups podcast by Exceeder. Join us as we speak with first-time founders, serial entrepreneurs, and experienced investors about the challenges and triumphs of running a biotech startup, from pre-seed to IPO, with your host, John Chi.
My guest today is Jason Foster, CEO and Executive Director at Ori Biotech. Ori is revolutionizing cell and gene therapy manufacturing through its development of its proprietary platform, IRO. By automating and standardizing cell and gene therapy manufacturing, Ori and IRO offer scientists the tools they need to streamline development and support widespread patient access to life-saving treatments. Jason's experience prior to Ori includes more than 20 years of life science leadership in operations, sales, marketing, technology, and investing, during which he developed deep expertise in commercial strategy and a thorough understanding of healthcare markets across the UK, US, and EU. Throughout Jason's career, he has helped build organizations that improve patient outcomes while delivering exceptional value for investors, like Indivior, where he played a pivotal role in its £2.3 billion public listing in 2014. Jason's wealth of experience offers invaluable insights for scientists, first-time founders, and industry leaders alike, making this series one you won't want to miss. Over the next 2 episodes, we'll explore Jason's inspiring journey, from his formative years and the early entrepreneurial lessons he learned, to the challenges of building and scaling Ori Biotech into a leading company. This series is packed with actionable wisdom into cultural adaptation, regulatory hurdles, and the power of mission-driven teams. Today, we'll discuss Jason's early years, exploring the personal and professional experiences that ignited his entrepreneurial drive. We'll hear about his upbringing, the influence of his family's business background, and the early jobs that honed his work ethic. From paper routes to marketing innovations, Jason's story offers invaluable lessons in creativity and resilience. Without further ado, let's dive into this episode of the Biotech Startups podcast. Jason, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It's good to see you again.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be on.
So in typical Biotech Startups podcast fashion, we always like to go as far back as we can to really learn about your kind of what has shaped your business philosophy and honestly, your leadership style. And so if we go all the way back, can you tell us a little bit about your upbringing and maybe what were those pivotal moments for you as you reflect that kind of shaped your journey, or at least style and business philosophy?
Well, I was kind of a cranky baby. No, I don't know if you want to go that far back. I grew up actually as an only child. So I spent a lot of time with adults and, with creative play, going through the woods, building a igloo out of sticks or whatever. And, that kind of, creative outlets. And I had half siblings that were older than me. The closest one was 11 years. So I always joked that I had the best of both worlds. I was an only child, but would get my butt kicked enough by my older siblings to not be a complete brat. I don't know if that actually worked in reality, but that was a joke. Anyway. So I think, that kind of idea of being creative, imaginative, using your imagination, and also learning to communicate at an early stage. I mean, if you think about what we do as human beings, the vast majority of the value we create is through communication, oral, written, increasingly through email, text message, website, marketing copy, social media. The written word is an incredibly powerful tool. And so as a kid who, spent a lot of time around adults as a young child, it helped hone some of those skills at a very early stage.
That's a similar experience. Well, I'm an only child as well. And actually it's super, I guess it's weird, but my wife is also an only child. So it's kind of like I don't run into only childs all too often, but I just happen to also marry an only child. And so, as you were, growing up, and it sounds like you're interfacing with a lot of adults, was business always kind of in that communication? Was it always kind of in the ether for you? Or was that something that, kind of you found the passion for business later on?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, my dad was a businessman. He was a salesman for an apparel company. So they sold technology that made jeans for
cool.
HT Lee or DoorDash or whomever. And he would go very cool, exotic sounding places like Japan for work. And it all sounded very sexy and appealing. When you're on the other side of it and you realize it's a lot of hotels and airports, you're not at all or appealing. But, when you're a kid, you're like, that sounds super cool. I want to do that. I want to be an international businessman, whatever that means. I don't know what that means, but it sounds super cool. My grandfather was very similar. He distributed and was a salesman for kitchen cabinets when he had his own distributorship. And so kind of that, my mother was also in business. So They were sort of, growing up in Richmond, Virginia, kind of a quaint little town compared to London where I live now. But, there were three jobs you could have. You could be a doctor, maybe four, a doctor, a lawyer, a banker, or a businessman, whatever that was. They were sort of like, today we have almost an innumerable number of different ways to form a career. And, as an influencer is apparently a job. I've been told. So that didn't exist back in the day. So I think business was always close to the family, and I was one of those kids that had like a paper route and used to cut the grass of the neighbors to get some pocket change and rake leaves, and so that kind of entrepreneurial flair of being self-sufficient and finding ways to make money was always part of the ethos. I remember going door to door and selling wrapping paper, which was people took pity on me and bought a roll here or there, but it was definitely not my career trajectory of choice after a few summers of doing that.
Yeah, totally. That's interesting too, because like I had a similar kind of, my parents, like in the summers, like, you're not hanging out here, like you need to go out there. And I know they like strategically set the allowance to be just like not enough to like, it wasn't enough to actually go have like a blast with my friends. So like, you got to go get that your own.
That's right. That's good. That's good training.
Yeah, it was good training. It was kind of like a Jedi mind trick by my parents. Like they just like were orchestrating in the background. And for me, one of my early jobs was basically, I grew up in Berkeley, was just hauling basically trash to the dump that people were. They're just like, we would drive around in our truck and just be like, you need that to go to the dump, and we would just like haul it and just pick up change left and right.
Great. Yeah, perfect. But they have that like 2-man in a van kind of stuff they've got it, and there's that's like a real business now.
Yeah,
it's actually one of the questions I often ask on almost every interview. Is I want to know what people's first job was, and if they're like, well, I got a job after college, and I'm like, no, like before that, like tell me a little bit, because you want to hear that, like I've had a lemonade stand, or whatever, I cut people's dog's hair, or whatever it was. There's something that shows a little bit of get up and go, a little bit of entrepreneurship. Because when you're working at a startup, there's so much that needs to get done, and people need to look laterally and find ways to add value. So that's the start of it, I think, when you're young.
Absolutely, and I think and we do the same thing actually. It's at Exeter where just some sort of experience like that. It could be entrepreneurial in nature. And we also, something that we like a lot too, is if someone has worked in hospitality or the service industry. Because I that was my other job. I was working at a deli, and basically if you can handle a disgruntled customer who's having a really bad day in hospitality and service, you can handle almost anything.
Who hates the sandwich you just made them? And
you're just like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I am so sorry. And I love that, because it's like, you can't really learn that from a book. Like, I guess you can put it
with the public. It's a very curated skill set. Yeah, I worked in retail, which wasn't that different. And actually I had the best hospitality job there is, the best commute to work. I was doing a summer in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. If you've ever been, absolutely beautiful place, Teton Mountains. The ski mountain, so Jackson Hole Resort, has a tram. It's maybe a 40-person tram. And at the top, there's something called Corbett's Cabin. And during the summer, people hike up the mountain, and it's there, and you've got snacks and really nasty hot dogs and old t-shirts that you sell. Yeah. So I used to commute in the tram every morning up to 10,700 feet or whatever it is, looking at the beautiful Teton Mountains to go work in Corbett's Cabin for a summer. And that was an awesome experience. I didn't make very much money selling bad hot dogs and old t-shirts, but it was still a great experience.
That's awesome. Yeah. Because did you get to go in the winter?
I went to ski, and that's how I fell in love with it, and then went back during the summer. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah. A lot of buddies of mine would like basically do ski lessons. And there's like, I just have a season pass, like, and basically,
or whatever I want. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
That's awesome.
And so, it sounds like you had a very, hands-on kind of business, kind of school of hard knocks education. As you were approaching, a college decision, can you walk me through, like, what was it? Where were you at that point in time? Did you know what you wanted to do? Did you know your major? Put us back in the kind of that mind state.
Yeah, I don't want anyone to get the impression that I was like walking the mean streets of Richmond, digging through trash cans for my next meal. I mean, I felt a very solid upper middle class upbringing, but yeah, I mean, I think having that, my father didn't go to college. He was working since the time he was 12. He had that kind of working class American dream, give your kids better than you had sort of mentality, and I think that rubbed off. And I was much less ambitious probably than kids are these days thinking about college. I was in Virginia. I grew up a University of Virginia fan of Virginia Cavaliers. I applied there basically as my first choice and my only real school I wanted to go to. And our rival school being a Virginia Cavaliers, Virginia Tech, which in its own right is probably a better athletic school, certainly in football. But at the time wasn't my choice. And so I always like to tell the story. Well, Virginia Tech tried to pay me to go there. They tried to give me a scholarship and I said no. And I went and paid my own way at Virginia. So that was, I literally applied to 3 schools. It was like Virginia Tech, and I think James Madison University, also in Virginia, not going too far away. My daughter's going through the same process now, and she's like, she's applying to Duke and UVA and, Princeton and Edinburgh and University College London, and she's got like a whole globe is open to her, and it's a whole.
That's different.
I don't think the schools are within 3,000 miles of each other, and mine were all within like a 2-hour drive. But anyway, that was the ambition. I just loved UVA. I loved the kind of history of the university and Thomas Jefferson and the academical village and how the whole evolution of that sort of piece of the state, and went there and had an amazing education, and it was somewhat affordable at that point, although adjusted for inflation, it's still pretty affordable these days as an in-state student. I mean, some of the private universities are $100,000 a year basically now for kids that go to college. I don't know how people make the economics work.
Me neither.
But staring at a high school senior basically who's footing the bill for, I'm like scratching my head like, how does this happen? So UVA was a great experience and started my journey in thinking beyond that sort of 2-hour radius in the center of Virginia, that there were actually really interesting things out there in the world that I should go maybe see.
Absolutely. And it's funny, like, as you're telling these like experiences, I also had a similar experience. So I grew up in Berkeley. I only applied to 3 schools. It was Berkeley, UCLA, and Davis. And it just so happened that you can just apply with like 1 click or like, I guess 3 clicks, but it's 1 application. Yeah. And I was like, I don't really want to leave the Bay Area. And I still haven't. I'm in San Francisco. So like my joke is that I was born in Berkeley and now I'm in San Francisco. So I've like been in maybe like a 7-mile radius, like my whole life at least. Yeah. So at least for you got out, like you went beyond the 2-mile radius.
At some point, I reached escape velocity.
I have not. Like we have not. I was just like stuck in orbit. I'm like, I guess I'm just in the Bay Area forever now.
That's right. You could be in worse places for sure.
Yeah, definitely. So at UVA, I know you focused on your major was government. Were there like what was that program like? Were there any professors that kind of like took you under their wing or perhaps inspired you and kind of kicked off this kind of what you said, getting out of orbit or the stratosphere?
Yeah. So it's interesting. I think my mother was a lobbyist at the state level. She used to lobby the state government in Virginia. And I got a little exposure to politics through that route. I was a page for the House of Delegates in Richmond. So you go for like 6 or 8 weeks and you take off school as a high school sophomore and you basically carry mail around the, Capitol Hill version in Richmond, but you get to see the process up close and it's enamoring. You get close to politics and it seems really cool. When I went back to D.C. and later in life, I then saw the sausage getting made. It was less enamoring, but I skip ahead to the end before I reach the beginning. But ultimately, Larry Sabato is at that time was one of the political pundits that was very well known. I took his class, kind of intro to politics, and it was just super interesting. I thought the kind of psychology behind elections and how people get elected and how the process works was super interesting. And ultimately, it came down to political science or history. History, I had to write a thesis. At that point, was relatively lazy and decided that political science should be the major. and history of the minor versus the other way around, because I was interested in both. And I didn't have to write a thesis in political science. So I'm bearing my soul. I'm telling you all of my secrets here. So, but that's it's funny. I was telling someone today who's coming out of their MBA and telling them a little bit about my career journey. And when you look at it backwards, it all sounds very well planned and it all fits together nicely. And there's a red thread. When you're in the middle of it, you're just sort of, you're hopping from lily pad to lily pad, trying to make the best decision you can with the information you have at that point. And it seemed to me as a, about to be newly graduated, 21-year-old, that Washington D.C. would be a pretty cool place to go and work and live for a while and go see the political process firsthand. So that's kind of the track that I ended up following as an undergrad, and then just post graduation. I worked for the House Commerce Committee, which makes healthcare policy, and at that, amongst other things, it does energy, it does a bunch of different things. But healthcare kind of caught my interest then, and this is when would this be, in 1998 or 9, something like that. And we were right in the middle of FDA reform. The committee was rewriting the FDA kind of authorization, and this was a big deal. And so got a lot of exposure to healthcare issues. And I'm like, what? Healthcare is super interesting. And obviously, a growth field. But also, if you're going to have an impact, I realized that actually the private sector was driving change more than the public sector. And that's kind of when the switch flipped for me. That I really need to get to the private side if I wanted to impact patients and impact lives versus being reactive in the government.
Yeah, and you're not alone in that sentiment. I had a conversation with Barry Tico, who's the chief medical officer of Stoke Therapeutics, and he said a similar thing. It wasn't in government, but he was like in the academic world for so long, and then he was like, got a taste of like what can be done in the private sector. Not to say that academic and nonprofit and government work isn't important.
Has value.
It is incredibly important, but to just see kind of this, like the speed in which you can have big impact pretty relatively quick, I think is something that, I think before, at least when I was at the bench, I was always told, like, if you're going to go to industry, you're going to the dark side. But fortunately now that sentiment has kind of changed, which is great, because like I don't think it has to be a dichotomy. It's definitely more of a gradient than anything. And there's like always a place for like pure research, but there's also a place for collaboration across the opposite ends. So very cool that you kind of had that exposure to healthcare during this period in DC that was kind of maybe not the most fun, but at least you got a spark of inspiration out of it. And maybe you ate Le Diplomat, which is great too.
Well, and also, I mean, I think the healthcare bug kind of really started there. And also it was right. So 2000, like right at the dot-com bubble, started, and then startups, we had sock puppets that were worth billions of dollars. And, there was a real kind of, it was the first wave where actually working in a startup seemed super cool. Like this, for us now, like it's been in fashion for now 25 years. And everyone's like, yeah, of course. But it wasn't always like that. It was sort of like, if you go to a big company like GE, that's the pinnacle. You sort of reach this industrial conglomerate, and working for a startup, like, why would you do that? It's not even a thing. Yeah. It's just a soon to be failed small business. You're like, no, this is interesting. You should listen to this. So I kind of have combined both of those things. So I had the healthcare experience that I thought was super interesting. I went to a startup, a .com startup. It only lasted 10 months. I was the second employee or third employee there. But as you know, with startup companies, you learn a lot quickly. You get sort of 10 years of experience in 2 years or something. And so it was there that I sort of realized that actually, you know what, I'm kind of really interested in building something, or, I've never been good at like coloring inside the lines. I'm very bad with authority. People telling me what to do, as most of my former bosses would contest. So it was kind of that, know what, I really like healthcare, and startups are cool, even though this one blew up. But I think there's something there, maybe, and those two pieces didn't come together for another 5 or 6 years. But I think that was the genesis of it, is those two experiences in Washington.
Very cool. And I know after your time in DC, you decided to get your MBA? And can you talk about that process for you, and why you chose Columbia?
Yeah, absolutely. So that was really my opportunity to make the jump from public policy to industry, having learned those things. Again, applied to 3 schools. So applied to Columbia, to Harvard, and to UVA, to go back to Charlottesville, which would have been lovely. It's a beautiful place. But I think for that stage of my career, being closer to the pharmaceutical center in New Jersey, and at this point, the kind of Boston really wasn't as big a biotech hub as it is now, but sort of a lot of stuff in the center of finance in New York seemed like an opportunity that shouldn't be passed up. So Columbia was a great choice for me, and we were there in kind of peak New York. So we actually moved. So my then girlfriend, now wife, and I moved from D.C. to New York 3 weeks before 9/11 happened.
Oh, wow.
And despite the obvious negatives of that event, it was a great time to be in New York. New Yorkers were proud to be New Yorkers and proud to be Americans. And it was a great time to be in New York. Student, and then, newly married young single couple that didn't have any kids and could, wind our way around New York City and enjoy that all it had to offer. So, Columbia was an amazing experience. And it was actually, for most of my life up until that point, I was a big fish in a small pond. I went to kind of a small high school, and I was, one of the smarter kids, and, did some AP classes and sort of did all right on my grades and played football and did those things that, high school kids do. But I never really you never really know until you really put it to the test. Like, can I compete? Can I hang with the big dogs? Can I,
Yep.
can I,
Yep.
And Columbia is a chance for me to do that. Columbia is a fantastic school. It recruits, I think it acceptance rate is in the, mid-single digits somewhere. And I was in there with, McKinsey consultants and Goldman Sachs bankers and a bunch of guys that were about to do private equity. And it was just, I was swimming with the sharks. And I was this, country bumpkin from Richmond who'd spent a little time in DC. And it was an eye-opening experience for me. It was really, I think, for me, the most formative part of my life, where I left my comfort zone. Even DC, kind of, DC just tacked on the top of Virginia. It's kind of, it's all, and there's tons of UVA people there, so it felt kind of safe. But going to New York was like going to the big city, and it was scary. And so that was an awesome experience for me. I mean, I think, they say about MBA, it's the network, it's the reputation. I remember maybe 2 or 3 factoids from classes, but, it's the content is less important than the rest of it. And so taking advantage of the learning campus in New York City, and, access to Wall Street, access, Pfizer's headquarters was there, access to New Jersey and the kind of biopharma hubs there was an opportunity to really, expand my horizons. And, I think 30% of my class was international at Columbia.
Oh, wow.
And to think, hey, there's a whole big wide world out there outside of not only Virginia, but also out of the US. So that might have foreshadowed some of my future decision making, which I'm sure we'll get to.
Yeah, absolutely. And my wife and I always wonder if what it would be like to go live in New York, kind of what you're describing before.
Yeah.
We don't have children yet, but we're just like, this is like a finite window in time when you can do this and actually enjoy New York. But then when that switches and you do have children, New York goes from awesome to maybe not so awesome, kind of
totally unmanageable. Yeah, no, I think that's probably wrong.
Yeah, not so awesome.
We're in the top 0.01% of wage earners having children in New York is impossible. So people move out, but yeah, it's a great time. And I would argue at some point everyone should live in New York City just to give it a go and see what it's like, because it's a great place. It has its own energy and its own vibe that's unlike any other city in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you're kind of like reflecting on your time at Columbia, were there any like memorable challenges or triumphs or standout moments of your graduate school experience that you can recollect?
There's actually 2 that kind of jump to mind. One is, so they call it a integrated project, an IP group, IP team that you get put with in your first year, and you're doing an integrated project, as you might imagine, that kind of brings together different parts of the curriculum. And there was a woman who had gone to Dartmouth, who'd grown up in kind of Rockland County, New York. There was a guy who'd grown up in Delhi, India, went to Penn, and then made his way to Columbia. There was a guy who'd grown up in the UK. His grandparents, I think, were the first patrons of Van Gogh. Like it was a very eclectic mix of people that I would have never been exposed to.
Yeah.
Had I not, had this experience and gone to Columbia, and those folks are still great friends. And I remember some very late nights working with them, 2, 3 in the morning when everyone was just wanting to go home. And, it was usually Deb and I who were like the last ones, like, we got to fix this paragraph. It doesn't quite work. And we were the word people and they were the analysts. And together we made a great team. And then we added another member who was from Canada, and she was great. So it's just like that experience of working in that totally diverse international team, and totally different from anyone I'd ever sort of really spent time with, was just such a great experience. And again, sort of awakened my passion to say there's just so much else out there, and the kind of having that international experience, thinking way back to my dad going to Japan, as I said, it's sort of like that the international realm and opportunity was just so appealing, at that point, working with an international team and doing great work. And we happened to get on that particular project the highest grade in the class. Not that I'm bragging now, 25. But we had a great time and did some great work. So that was one. And then there was another one. There was a turnarounds class. This is one of the few bits of content that I remember. And it was one of those that really, there were two things that there's like moments of clarity. When you get those like lightning bolts moments of clarity, like you're just like, yeah, of course. Yeah. So there was a project, the very first project we had to work on, our case study. There was no solution. The point of it was there was no solution. And you spent hours like agonizing over this thing, like, why is it not working? Like, why is there no answer here? And Sanjeet, the guy from Delhi, just came and he's like, we just need to do this. We just need to for him, because his family was in business, he's like, we should just factor the receivables. I don't know, make it like 8%, whatever the number is. And we're like, okay, that sounds like a reasonable solution. But ultimately, the answer was to choose the least worst option. They gave you a set of options. None of them were particularly good. You looked at the cost of capital to do various different things, and you said, I'm going to pick the least worst option. There is no right answer, but the least worst option is the right answer. And I think that parable has kept me in good stead for the rest of my career, because there's not always a great answer. Sometimes the least worst answer is the right answer. And that is certainly the case in startups where, there's not always an obvious path forward. And sometimes you just have to make the least worst choice.
That is incredible. Like, you mentioned that the MBA is more about the network, but these are like real lessons. Like these are like real lessons. Like that's like an educational experience. So I don't know if it's just the network.
I told you there's a couple of golden nuggets in there with content. And that was one of them. There's another one I'll tell you, which I'll never forget. So actually, funnily enough, a guy that I knew in high school, went from Richmond, different high school, but sort of knew each other. We then went to UVA together. Our fraternities we're great friends in uni and have continued to be great friends. He ended up at Columbia in the same class.
Oh, wow.
I know this guy. Like I had known this guy since I was like 16, and for the better part of a decade. Like I know this person. I know how he thinks. We were in a negotiations class, and we were tasked with splitting up $1. And the rules were the person who made the offer. I forget exactly how it works. I'm going to butcher the explanation, but you'll get the point. Which is essentially, I had to write down what I was willing to accept, and they had to write. So I had $1, and they had to make a bid. And if they made a bid that matched what I was willing to accept, then we would do a deal. And if they didn't, then we wouldn't effectively. And so the rational play to split $1. If you've got 0 and I've got $1. You should be willing to take any bid greater than 1 penny, because you're better off having 1 penny than no pennies. That's the rational play. And this guy was like an analyst in a mutual fund, like analyzing stocks and the most, whatever that is, left brain or, the most analytical person. And I'm like, clearly he's going to do the rational thing. So I said, I'd be willing to accept any bid over 3 cents because, or under 3 cents, whatever it is. Because, maybe he's got a little bit of irrationality, but he's not going to be flipped. So what was the bid he offered? 50 cents. The only amount he'd be willing to take was 50 cents or more. And I said, why? You have 0. And so we both ended up with 0, because we couldn't make a deal. And I said, you should be happy with anything over 1 cent. And he's like, yeah, but it's not fair. And I'm like, fairness has nothing to do with this. What do you mean? This is a business deal. And I said, if it was $1 million, what would your bid have been? He was like, yeah, like $100. And I'm like, not 500,000? No, of course not. But he's like, the order of magnitude matters. And I'm like, well, shit, that makes no sense, but I get it. We're human beings. We're not rational beings. We do things that are emotional. And you're like, well, screw it, for 1 penny. I'm not doing that unless it's 50 cents, 50 cents. So, there are a couple of things that, again, the people not being rational beings making rational decisions is another lesson that you carry forward with you and say, you know what, actually the rational decision would be that, but probably that's not going to where we end up, or be where we end up. So
totally. And, there's a bunch of things that are coming to mind. Like, I guess on the first one, on your kind of integrated project, I think that's like a crash course of like, just like how do you work efficiently with just like different styles and cultural kind of norms. And like in a startup, you're going to have that ultimately, because like people are like from different walks of life, and like people are going to be extroverted, introverted. People are going to be more like math oriented or more like qualitatively oriented, or quantitative versus qualitative. And I think that's like incredibly important, that like that lesson you probably experienced firsthand, like early on, like in a kind of a project like that, is like, you can't just like bludgeon, like, we're going to do it this way, my way or the highway, or it just doesn't work that way. And so that's like the first thing that came to my mind.
I was going to say at Ori, we certainly learned that lesson, in that we've got a very large engineering team, and engineers come from an archetype, and you're attracted to things for a reason. And engineering is one of those things that very sort of analytical, math-minded folks are attracted to. And we've got a lot of biologists, and, in biology, there's a lot of, art, and there's the biology doesn't always behave like it should. And it doesn't, it's not always biology is not always rational.
Yeah.
And bringing those two groups together and getting them to work together in a very effective way, which we have done because we have fantastic people at Ori, wasn't the easiest. Having a lot of biologists and a lot of engineers that have to work together on a day-to-day basis was just that on a larger scale.
Yep, absolutely. And I think that's like, at least for me, I've always felt like I was like more of like a generalist that's why I'm not in the lab anymore. It's because I was like, dang, my colleagues over there who can just like go deep, super deep, and just focus, like that wasn't me. Like, I can go deep, but like that level of dedication and like kind of precision, I was like, oh, I don't got that. But that's exactly, it's kind of like, how do you make these like differing kind of approaches like harmonize, which is like incredibly important, because if you don't, what is going to be kind of a zero-sum situation where one person's like, we're doing it the engineering way, and then everything else atrophies, and you're just like, oh my God, we have to work together, we're on a team.
Yeah, no, I mean, people management, engineers, people management, these things can be tough.
Yeah, absolutely.
The EQ and the IQ both have to be engaged. You can't have too much IQ and not enough EQ.
Absolutely. And on the turnaround experience, that's like super fascinating too. And I think, coming out of school, I felt like there's always going to be an answer, like a right and wrong. But that experience is just like, no, like there isn't, like, a decision needs to be made. Like, also, like, indecision is not the right decision either.
That's right.
You got to do something.
To not make a decision, and that's not going to move the ball forward. No, exactly right. You have to choose a path. And that's what, now I sit on a couple boards of startups, and, obviously I'm a full-time operator and CEO at Ori, and, I counsel the team, the leadership team, and the boards, the kind of leadership teams, the companies I sit on, to say, just make a decision. You can course correct. You don't have all the information. It's always going to be an imperfect, situation, but make the best decision you can with the information you have, and retain the optionality to flex if you have to. And that's definitely not making a decision is the worst of the options, because that will definitely lead to a bad outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know, because like you can it can feel like, especially when you're posed with two hard decisions, and you're just like, I don't like the inaction is like comfortable. It's like you're just you're forestalling the inevitable, but like that is not what you want to do. Like, that is not what you want to do. You end up getting in the worst position.
Exactly. It's even worse when you're using resources to get more and more data and do more and more analysis to be more and more analysis paralysis. It's sort of, that's a way to look like we're doing something valuable, but just avoid making a decision.
Yeah.
And so I think that people do often fall into that trap of, well, we'll just, we'll interview a few more key opinion leaders, or we'll just buy this report, or we'll look for that data, when it's probably on the margin, not going to make a difference, and they just should be making a decision.
Yeah, absolutely. And the I think it was Bezos who this is attributed to. It's just like one-way doors versus two-way doors, where like if the decision is like a one-way door and you don't have the option to go back, think long and hard about that one.
That's right. Yeah.
But if it's a two-way door, send it. Like just send it, and then you can course correct. Yeah. Like there's no reason to be like hemming and hawing over it. And then the last point about your third kind of learned moment of the rational kind of like decision making, like it's interesting because my co-founder is in private equity, and he's very like hyper rational, a student of game theory, like just like. But I'm the guy who plays hearts and shoots the moon every time. And he's like, why?
Why would you do that?
Why would you do that? And I'm like, why not? I'm like, why not?
Great compliment. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's something too, like early days, I thought that, especially doing sales for Exceeder when it was just me just like pounding the pavement, was that I thought like sales was like a rational decision, but oftentimes it is not. Like it is very much like an emotional one. There's like, I would even argue that like it's primarily emotional, and kind of like you're navigating kind of status, like how are people going to reputation, like are all of these things. The numbers could look perfect, but if you don't line up these other aspects, you're not going to get across the line, which can be frustrating.
100%. Yeah, no, there's tons of great literature about effective sales, and The Challenger Sale is one of the better books that I read around these things. And, they talk about essentially, sales is a human endeavor. One of my mentors used to say, there's nothing happening in a sales call or sales meeting other than one human being talking to another human being. That's literally all that's happening. And so how you build rapport, how you establish a relationship, how you effectively match and discover and actively listen and question to understand the real needs of what's trying to solve, what's motivating them, and trying to match what you have to offer with what they need. I mean, that is the art of selling. And what's really frustrating in the UK, the NHS is, obviously the National Health Service, the public payer healthcare system, is an incredibly challenging customer for startup health tech businesses in the UK, because you don't know what they care about. I vastly prefer a private company that you understand. They want to make money. Great. If you want to make money, we can figure out all the ways in which we can help you improve quality, make money, and do all the things you want to do. And that's a much easier conversation to have. And so it can have, bigger purposes around it. But ultimately, and I think what people don't appreciate, I think that the pharma industry, which I've been part of for 25 years or so, in different guises, has done probably the worst job of any industry of PR, of demonstrating and clearly articulating the value that they have created. If you look at the lifespans globally, they continue to increase. Knowing people in their 90s and hundreds is commonplace these days, especially in different parts of the world. A lot of that is due to the pharmaceutical interventions that exist today that didn't exist 50 years ago. But if you look at the list of industries that people hate, pharmaceuticals is like right above oil and gas and tobacco. It's like literally at the bottom of the list. And you're like, how is this possible? If you go to the doctor and you've got, I don't know, whatever, you've got a problem. If they don't write you a prescription, you're like, what are you doing? Like, you're not even practicing medicine if I don't walk out of here with a prescription. But, it's such a norm. But again, you think about, well, actually, people in the industry are afraid to say, like, we're a for-profit company. We have to make money. so that we can invest in the next generation of therapies. Everyone has to understand that this is a for-profit effort. This is not a not-for-profit effort. So it's that kind of, thing. I think it's just sometimes things that don't make sense to me. But that sales conversation of trying to match and trying to build relationships, and people, that's what they say, people buy from people, right? And it's, does this person understand me? Can they help me? Do they have my best interest in mind, at least in parallel with their own? Those kinds of things are what sell. Not feet. If you're talking about ours is better than theirs.
Yeah. That always is like insufficient. Insufficient. Right. My first kind of foray into sales for Exceeder was the UC system and Lawrence Berkeley, which was like, okay, we have the state level, and then we're doing federal sales too. I didn't know better. Right. So I was like jumped head first into just like a pool of sharks. I was like, I was getting eviscerated.
I'm in the wrong place.
Yeah, I got eviscerated. I was just a bench scientist. And I just thought that selling the feature and selling just like this number is better than this number, like right,
better than theirs. Yeah,
yeah. And it was just like they're like, you could just see like nods, but like people were just not really that into this.
Not engaged.
Yeah. And then we ended up refocusing to exactly what you mentioned, the private sector, where that is a little bit more clear. It's not always crystal clear, but it was like a little bit more clear. And something too is that with the kind of our businesses being in science, it can almost give you the false sense that everything is rational because it's kind of like empirical, published, peer-reviewed.
Right. Peer-reviewed, and that means something.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, it's all comprised of people who are emotional. So it's like, if you try to, ignore that aspect, or that it's kind of the other half of the coin, you're at a significant disadvantage. And even science and the sciences, broadly speaking, are, have that aspect to it, like it or not.
If you think about it, like even peer review, you just think about what that is. That is third-party endorsement, right? JAMA, New England Journal, The Lancet is leveraging the reputation of those journals and the reviewers, the peers that are reviewing the proxy trust that they have to get validation for your idea. It's a human endeavor. It has nothing to do really with the quality of the science. We assume that it does, and that's how things end up in that publication. But again, it's humans communicating with other humans, and in that case, you're using essentially third-party validation, which is a very powerful sales technique. Who else? When they ask you who else is using this, oh well, this big company that you've heard of, rather than this company over here you've never heard of before. It makes a difference. This is how human beings think and how we operate.
Absolutely, it's funny. So, my wife worked at the Public Library of Science. So kind of similar to your DC experience, I kind of via osmosis, I was like seeing how the peer review process works, and I was like, holy crap! Like there, like so many, like like everyone has different interests too, and you're just like, this is like, how can this be purely objective? Like it is actually impossible. Obviously there's an attempt to be, and not to say that, but. Yeah. Still, it is unavoidable that there's going to be this kind of human or irrationality.
Wherever there's humans involved, there is bias and there are errors.
Exactly. Exactly. So you're wrapping up your time at Columbia. Did you know where you're heading next? Can you talk a little bit about what was kind of the next phase of your journey?
Yeah, so Columbia was an opportunity for me to switch from the public sector to the private sector. And so I really wanted to get into the private sector of healthcare. And I thought pharmaceuticals was the place where I could go and learn a lot and make a difference. And that sounded interesting. You were probably not alive then, or certainly very young. In 2000, the dot-com bubble, there were incredible amounts of economic activity. I think from the year, so 2000, 2003, no, 2001, no, 2001, sorry. 2001, when I started business school, August 2001, that prior spring, the May graduating class of 2001, from Columbia alone, so there has 600 odd students at that point, 68 of them got hired by McKinsey, just from Columbia. That's how bubbly the,
Oh my
the
God.
was at that point. And I'm like, I got into Columbia. This is going to be awesome.
Yeah.
I'm going to be picking from offers. It's going to be fab. 9/11 happens. The whole economy flips over. There are no jobs. Like literally by 2003, when I went to get a job, there were no jobs. And so, I was very lucky that I met a Columbia alumni at Merck. So it was the Merck Medco on the Medco side, on the PBM side at that point. I didn't really know what a PBM was. I knew Merck, but, sort of only vaguely, and was lucky enough to get into a management rotational program at Medco, in the Medco division, which shortly after got spun out of Merck. So it was Merck Medco, and it just became Medco Health Solutions after that. But it was literally my only option. I would have been, panhandling on the street or something with all the other former MBAs, trying to, make ends meet if I hadn't gotten a job at Medco. But it turned into a fantastic learning experience, and I still have some great friends from that. So, as I said, when I tell it in retrospect, it all sounds extremely well planned. But you got to work hard. You got to get lucky. You got to work the relationships, and again, people. This individual really helped me sort of. It wasn't even public that they had this program, and so he helped me get in the door and get an interview, and the rest is history, as they say. So I was really excited to get into industry, get a toehold wherever I could, and learned a huge amount about how drugs get priced, about how they get accessed by patients, how they get to pharmacies, pharmacy contracting, rebates. I mean, incredible formularies, P&T committees, all this stuff that like most people have no clue what they even are. Market access strategies, health economics. Like this was all an amazing education about how drugs actually get priced, how they get made accessible for patients. And so it was a great introduction to the industry, which I didn't realize I was getting, but did end up getting while I was there.
Sounds like a baptism of fire to me, because like for me, I've always lived in like the preclinical world. Like, there's like a distant future of like everyone's crossing their fingers for an approval that this thing is going to actually go out and get commercialized and actually get into the hands of patients. And the lucky few do get through. But after that, it's kind of like this like black box. They're like, all right, it's like, now that's over there. That's for you guys to handle. So I can't imagine, you probably it was just like complete mind expansion of like seeing how this apparatus works. And so after your time at Medco, this baptism of fire, kind of really getting your tactical and like hands-on to the pharma industry. When did you know it was time to move on, and what was up next?
I was at Medco for like 2.5 years. I did 2 jobs there. So I studied marketing. And what I love about marketing is there's a huge amount of psychology about why people choose to buy. And, we talk a little bit about sales, but the psychology behind influencing purchase decisions, super interesting. A little bit of game theory, as we talked about earlier. So I was working functionally in marketing within Medco. And then I got to start my own division. So I went from what they called home delivery marketing. So they have a mail order pharmacy where people can get drugs shipped to their homes, bypassing like a CVS or a Walgreens or whomever. And started out there, and then moved to start an organization called Field Marketing, which essentially supported the sales team with sales collateral, if you would, around 11 different lines of business in Medco. So I got to learn the whole business from end to end, what every individual kind of product offering, if you will, was within the business. But I also got the flavor of starting my own thing within a big business. I got to start a division, a subdivision that didn't exist before, and so I had creative license to kind of define what it was and work with a lot of stakeholders. I got to manage my first employee, Paula, if you're out there, I hope you're doing well. She was awesome, and got some of those life experiences that were beneficial. Moving forward, I'm like, what, I really like this thing, this kind of running my own show in this little corner of Medco. And at that point decided that, I was going to go try something different. It was kind of like big company, got an experience, got a little taste of something smaller inside. That was interesting. But I really wasn't working in pharma. I was working in managed care. It's a little bit different. PBMs are adjacent. So I went to a small boutique consultancy, which at the time was called Campbell Alliance, for a very short period, to try my hand at pharma consulting. And at that phase, the government had instituted Medicare Part D, which, as you know, is the drug benefit for Medicare, which didn't used to cover pharmaceuticals. And that was a massive time of opportunity for the industry. And I was trying to figure out, do we participate? Don't we participate? There was something called the donut hole. No one understood what that was. There's all this like new regulation and new stuff to learn. So I did a lot of Part D work in my short time there with big companies, big pharma companies that everyone knows the name of. And that was super interesting. And at that point, I actually, when I was looking to move from Medco to something else, I had a job search running and a job opportunity came up in Richmond, Virginia. And I'm like, well, that's interesting. Pharmaceutical marketing, brand management in Richmond, Virginia. There's like one company in Virginia that's a pharmaceutical company. But at that point, as we talked about, my wife and I had been a couple of years married. We were thinking about maybe it might be time to have a kid. We live in Manhattan in a one-bedroom apartment. That's not going to work. So a couple of things sort of came together. And so I ended up getting a job at what was then a very, very small part of the large conglomerate called Reckitt Benckiser. Reckitt Benckiser is not a company most people know the name of, but they know their products like Lysol and Dr. Scholl's. And there's a bunch of brands that sort of in the US are very common. They compete with P&G and Colgate, Palmolive, and Clorox and those guys. But they had a very small pharmaceutical division in Richmond, Virginia, which was unknown to me until then. But I remember I couldn't go down for an interview. I had to fly down on a Saturday morning, and the CEO and my eventual boss, the head of marketing, came in on a Saturday morning to interview me. And we walked in, and the floors were sticky because they had replacing the carpet. And it was just like a big room. Like literally there was no one in this huge room. I'm like, how many people work in this company? And they're like, you'll be the fifth one. You'll be the fifth person. I'm like, okay, this sounds interesting. It's a real company or not?
Yeah. Am I going to get kidnapped? Like this is
exactly. Like,
are you trying to trap me here?
It was a little bit like, boiler room or office space where there's like this weird, faux office setup.
Yeah.
But they operated in so it was a small molecule company, specialty pharmaceuticals, operating in a really interesting part of the market in addiction medicine. So opioid addiction, pretty much up until that point in 2003, 4, or 5, was really heroin addiction, and it was only treated by methadone. And everyone has the social stigma associated with heroin use. You kind of have a picture of what that looks like in your mind. But about that time, OxyContin started, and sort of the prescription opiates started, and we all know how that story ends. And this company offered a office-based alternative to methadone. So I could go to my GP and get treated, with a prescription in a normal fashion. And if I was, a soccer mom or a lot of people, former athletes, a lot of people get addicted to opioids because they have surgery, and then, maybe they have a sports injury or whatever, the backache. And so people kind of, innocently wander into this. And then for whatever reason, addiction is a DSM-5 now criteria. It's a psychological condition. And so most people don't realize that. And they think just it's bad people doing bad things. It's a moral problem when actually it's a psychological condition. And so I learned a huge amount about not only pharmaceuticals and brand management, but also addiction medicine, around psychiatric disorders, and all kinds of other incredible lessons. But being the fifth employee in that business, it brought us back to Virginia, where my daughter was born, and we did sort of bought a house and a white picket fence and a dog, and sort of settled into that experience in 2006. It was. Grew that business from 5 people to 400 people in 4 years. So massive growth. I think I trained the first 220 salespeople in that business. So it was another baptism by fire. It was kind of that small opportunity right in the heart of the industry I wanted to be in, but a chance to really learn a lot and, color outside the lines and have a big impact. So we grew that business very quickly. It grew to $1 billion in revenue, ultimately. And we, built an incredible franchise. I think, we used to count the number of patients that got treated. If I had, average doses and trying to calculate who who was ending up on therapy, but we think, 1 million people got therapy when I was there that may have not had treatment otherwise. And, addiction is a family disease. It impacts another 3 or 4 people around the individual. It has huge economic impacts on families. And so you felt really good about that and offering this alternative to people that probably wouldn't have gone, to the wrong side of the tracks to get methadone, or never would have considered it, because that's for heroin addicts. I'm just taking too many pills. So there was all of that stuff going on. But it was an incredible experience going from 5 to 400. And then in 2010, the CEO said, "Hey, do you want to go to Europe and help start the European business?" I'm looking at my 2-year-old daughter, my house I just bought, my wife's pregnant, 5 months pregnant with our son. Like, this isn't great timing. We live a mile down the street from my parents, babysitting. But, the opportunity to kind of realize that dream of international business and going to live somewhere else and experience another culture was too good a draw. And, my wife had done a summer at Regent's College and loved London, and it seemed like a good fit. So we ended up, blowing up our whole life in Richmond, which was supposed to be like the forever bit.
Yeah.
And moving to London, which was a whole nother startup experience in the same company on a different continent.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Biotech Startups podcast featuring Jason Foster. Be sure to tune in for part 2, where Jason reflects on his transition to the healthcare sector, his insights into scaling startups, and the pivotal moments that shaped Ori Biotech's mission. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your friends. See you next time. The Biotech Startups podcast is produced by Exceeder. Don't want to miss an episode? Search for the Biotech Startups podcast wherever you get your podcasts and click subscribe. Exceeder provides research labs with equipment leases on founder-friendly terms to support paths to exceptional outcomes. To learn more, visit our website www.exceeder.com. On behalf of the team here at Exceeder, thanks for listening. The Biotech Startups podcast provides general insights into the life science sector through the experiences of its guests. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from the podcast is at the user's own risk. The views expressed by the participants are their own and are not the views of Exceeder or sponsors. No reference to any product, service, or company in the podcast is an endorsement by Exceeder or its guests.